Gus Malzahn is gone. He's hanging up his clipboard and his visor for good, going into retirement. Man, how will you remember the man who drove the Gus bus and drove Nick Saban nuts? Where does he rank on the list of Auburn's all-time greatest coaches? Find out next on Scarbo Knows. What will college football do without Gus Malzahn to kick around? Or without Gus Malzahn to kick around Alabama? They should be celebrating in Tuscaloosa after the damage he did to the Crimson Tide through the years, including last season in Tallahassee. His last year, little did we know that would be his last season as the offensive coordinator at Florida State. There he is. That was his favorite phrase. How many times did we see him on the sideline punctuate it with a boom after a big play, a touchdown, a read option, a pop pass, all the innovations that he brought from high school football in Arkansas to college football in the SEC. Gus was one of a kind. And we're going to talk about his legacy today. It's kind of gotten overshadowed with all the other news going on in college sports. First of all, let's say thank you to our sponsor, Money Management Services. They are Birmingham's financial services firm. Since 1992, they've been taking care of all of your financial needs. They can help you. There you see the QR code on the screen. Look them up. Ring them up. The Rice family, good friends of mine. They'll take great care of you. We'll hear from them later in the show. And thank you to all of you for watching here on the Sidelines.live network. Plenty of great shows all day long. Joined Rob Brown this morning. You can always catch those, of course, on the rebound. Since we're in college basketball season, we can say that. You can always follow me, of course, on X/Twitter. We will be tweeting all weekend long as usual. Be at the Alabama-Auburn basketball game in Neville Arena. But we're not here to talk about basketball right now. We're here to talk about college football. We're here to talk about Auburn football. We're here to talk about not the best coach in Auburn history, but maybe the most interesting and perhaps the most memorable in Gus Malzahn. And he put out a statement this week. The news came out a few days ago that he has decided after 35 years of coaching, 15 on the high school level in Arkansas. He won multiple state championships, changed the game on the high school level, not just statewide, but nationally. And then he moved on. Houston Nutt hired him at Arkansas, made him the offensive coordinator in 2006, kind of a package deal with quarterback Mitch Mustaine and some other future Razorbacks who came with Gus from his high school program, got them to the SEC championship game in his first year. Then he went to Tulsa, set all kinds of records, and then started the most memorable chapter of his career. One of the smartest things Gene Chizik did in his star-crossed tenure as the Auburn coach was hire Gus Malzahn as his offensive coordinator before the 2009 season. And man, so many memories, so many big games, so many highlight plays, and we're going to get into some of that as we go through the show today. But let's look at the statement from Gus. It was very subtle. It was very humble. It was very Gus. That's who he is as a person. Certainly, like all coaches, he has an ego, but he kept it in check better than just about anyone else that reached the heights that he hit throughout his college football coaching career. Of course, he thanked his wife, Christy, who's been alongside him for the entire journey. Christy is a trip. She will tweet at you on social media. She will let you know if you say something or write something that she doesn't like about her husband. She's been a great partner to Gus for a long time, and he talked about his daughters, Kylie and Kenzie, talked about all the administrators who gave him the opportunities that he got. And I love the part about him thanking all of the players, that he said it was a joy of a lifetime to coach you. I'm proud of the many accomplishments and wins you had on the field. But what's brought me the most joy is seeing the husbands and fathers so many of you have become. Always remember to use your influence in a positive way. And that was Gus. Uh, he was not controversial in many ways. As a football coach, he was, but not as an individual. Auburn, which has had its share of scandal in its football program throughout history in the past, had none of that really with Gus. I know the Cam Newton stuff in 2010 was when Gus was the offensive coordinator, but that really wasn't touched by Gus Malzahn, or didn't really touch Gus Malzahn. So certainly since he became the head coach at Auburn from 2013 to 2020, relatively scandal-free. The biggest scandal every year for Auburn fans was Gus going to call the plays? Was he going to hire an offensive coordinator? Was he going to bow to pressure from powerful boosters to bring in someone, say a Chip Lindsey, to take over the play calling? Was he going to decide to retire or unretire his clipboard? That was a constant drama throughout Gus's tenure on the Plains as head coach. But again, just a very memorable career as a football coach. Let's look at his record for a moment. We're not going to dwell too much on numbers, but we have to at least give you some perspective on the Gus Malzahn years. And we're going to focus on Auburn, of course, because that's where he made his greatest impact. That's where most people came to know him. That's where his influence really stemmed from and began to grow across the country. How many coaches can say they changed the game? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But if you look overall, of course, he spent 3 years as the offensive coordinator at Auburn. He spent 8 years as the head coach. The year in between, he left, went to Arkansas State, became the head coach there, won a Sun Belt championship. So Gus was a winner above all else. Now, he wasn't a winner on the level of Nick Saban. No one else has done that. He's not a winner on the level of a Kirby Smart, but he was a winner. And there's one thing that stands out about all those numbers, and he was 98-45 overall as the OC and the head coach at Auburn, 54-36 in the SEC. Good, not great numbers. But if you notice, if you go down those lists, there's not a single losing season. So do you want to be a glass half full person or a glass half empty guy? That's really the question. Yeah, there are a lot of 4-loss seasons in there, 4 losses or more, but there is not a losing season. And as everyone knows by now, since Gus Malzahn left Auburn, the Tigers have not had a single winning season in football. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. Now, I will say this. I would not go back and relitigate the firing of Gus Malzahn. It was the right thing at the time for Auburn and for Gus to part company. Gus had been there 8 years. It was trailing off. He had some highlights in 2019, but his last 10-win season was 2017. They went 6-4 in that strange COVID year of 2020 when the SEC played all SEC opponents, no non-conference opponents until the playoff. And it really was time for a change. The problem is not that they made a change. The problem is who they changed to. One Brian Harsin. That's what started the downward spiral of Auburn. But they were really trending downward in Gus's last couple of years, as you can see by the record: 8-5 in 2018, 9-4 in 2019, and 6-4 in 2020. It didn't look like at that point, with the exception of the 2019 Iron Bowl, one of the wackiest games of all time in college football, 48-45, Auburn won it. But it didn't look like at that point that Gus was going to be able to continue to compete with Nick Saban and particularly with Kirby Smart. Auburn still hasn't beaten Georgia since 2017, since Gus and the Tigers did it in the regular season when Georgia was ranked number 1, and then they went on to beat number 1 Alabama. I don't know that anyone's ever done that in the history of college football, beating 2 number 1 teams in a 3-week period. Auburn did it with Gus Malzahn as head coach. But you really have to put this into perspective by looking at Gus among other Auburn coaches. Where does he rank in Auburn history? This has been a great subject for debate since Gus announced his retirement. Now, there are 2 names that are not on this list. Shug Jordan, whose name is on the stadium, and Pat Dye, whose name is on the field inside Jordan-Hare Stadium. Those guys stand alone and above everyone else who's ever coached at Auburn. And don't hit me with Mike Donahue back in the 1900s, 1910s, who had an incredible record and won some national championships that Auburn now recognizes. I know he did a great job. I know what the record says, but we're talking about basically modern football and postmodern football. And Shug Jordan and Pat Dye, in either order, You can rank those as you see fit. I would rank Pat Dye as the most impactful Auburn football coach because he was the one under his watch, thanks to his strength of will and his success as a recruiter, as a coach, as a leader, that allowed Auburn to look Alabama in the eye and really take over the state for a time after Bear Bryant retired and sadly passed away shortly thereafter. So we're going to look at the post-Pat Dye coaches, and there have been, well, we're going to look at the post-Pat Dye coaches up until 2020 because there's no sense going back and dredging up the ugly memories under Brian Harsin and Hugh Freeze. Okay? So let's look at Terry Bowden, Tommy Tuberville, Gene Chizik, and Gus Malzahn in that order. And the records are interesting. Actually, Terry Bowden has the best record, the best winning percentage of any of those coaches between Pat Dye and the coach whose name shall not be uttered after Gus Malzahn. He won 73% of his games. Tuberville won 68% of his games. Chizik won 64% of his games, and Gus won 66% of his games. And, of course, a lot of Chizik's wins, all but 3 of them came with Gus Malzahn as his offensive coordinator because Chizik went 3-9 in 2012 after Gus went on to Arkansas State to learn how to be a head coach on the college level, and he learned pretty quick. As I said, he won a Sun Belt title. So where would you rank Gus on that list? Now, again, if you go by pure numbers, you got to say Terry Bowden. Tommy Tuberville won 6 consecutive games against Alabama. But I would argue that the 3 wins that Gus Malzahn had over Alabama when it was coached by Nick Saban are at least the equivalent of Tuberville's 6 straight against Dennis Franchione, 4 against Mike Shula, and 1 in the very first year that Saban was at Alabama. And that game was played on the Plains. Far more impactful, far more difficult to win 3 games against the Saban Alabama teams than the Alabama teams that Tommy Tuberville built. So I would give Gus an edge over Tuberville. Now, Chizik has the national championship, but he wouldn't have it without Gus Malzahn as OC. No one would argue that point. So I think you can make a really good case that the best coach at Auburn between Pat Dye and the coach who shall not be named has been Gus Malzahn. All right? Think of the memories that Auburn generated while Gus was there. This is why I say he's one of the most memorable coaches in Auburn history, if not the most productive or the best leader, the best recruiter, however you want to judge head coaches. 2 memories, of course, stand out. You cannot talk about Auburn football. From now until the end of time, you will not be able to talk about Auburn football without talking about the prayer in Jordan Hare and the kick 6 from 2013. Those games will forever be burned into the brains of Auburn people now, Auburn people yet to be born, because those memories will be passed down from generation to generation. And interestingly, you know, the prayer in Jordan Hare, and I'm going to take credit, I actually dubbed it that night in the press box, writing my column for the Birmingham News and AL.com live under a tight deadline, shaking my head, still not believing what I had just witnessed. There was luck involved in that play. There is no question about it. You see the 2 Georgia defenders on the left in the picture. If you're watching on the Sidelines.live network or on YouTube, you see Ricardo Lewis, who kept running with the ball being deflected by the 2 Georgia defenders who came together and somehow, some way, with eyes in the back of his head, tracked the ball and snatched the ball out of the air and then took it into the end zone for the winning touchdown. Yes, there was luck involved in that game. There was no luck involved in the kick 6. That if you still stick to that narrative, and there were a lot of rationalizations offered by Alabama fans at the time. Oh, he stepped out of bounds. They missed that. No, they didn't. It's been shown a million times on a million different venues. Chris Davis, number 11, did not step out of bounds after he gathered in the missed field goal 9 yards deep in the end zone and took it back 109 yards into immortality. The fact that they put someone back to potentially run back a missed field goal that came up short was coaching. The fact that they switched the return man and put Chris Davis back there was coaching. So another point that people have missed through the years, Alabama was undefeated. Alabama was going for a third consecutive national championship in that game. Gus was in his first season as the head coach at Auburn. The year before Gus got there, as we've already mentioned, Gene Chizik went 3-9 overall and 0-8 in the SEC. And Gus Malzahn won 12 games that next year, which is still, and maybe forever will be, the greatest single-season turnaround in SEC history. He won 9 more games in 2013 than Chizik and company had won in 2012. One of them was the Prairie and Jordan Hare. The capper was the kick 6. There was coaching involved. You know how many yards Auburn ran for in that kick 6 game in 2013? 294. I didn't stutter. Auburn ran for 294 yards against a Nick Saban, Kirby Smart defense. Think about that for a second. That's coaching. That's game planning. That's strategizing. That's play calling. That's everything that goes into coaching, especially if you're an offensive guru, as Gus was. Incredible performance. And I will argue this until the day that I no longer have breath in my body. The drive that Auburn put together late in the fourth quarter, it was tied going into the fourth quarter at 21. A.J. McCarron, who's on the short list of Heisman candidates at the time, he throws a 99-yard touchdown pass to Amari Cooper, and Alabama's leading 28-21. Auburn gets the ball back late, still with a chance to tie and or win because Alabama couldn't make a short field goal. And Auburn drives down the field with a former defensive back at quarterback in Nick Marshall. And as good a coaching job as Gus Malzahn did with Cam Newton, he did an even better one with Nick Marshall. Because Nick Marshall didn't go on and become an NFL MVP like Cam Newton. Nick Marshall didn't win the Heisman. But Nick Marshall was an incredible college quarterback because he was coached by Gus Malzahn. And on that final drive that Auburn had to have to tie, Auburn ran the ball, they ran the ball, they ran the ball, they ran the ball, they ran the ball. I think 5 or 6 straight runs. And they get the ball across midfield, and they run what looks like another read option with Nick Marshall running to his left, which means he would have to throw across his body. Alabama certainly believes it's either going to be a keeper or a pitch. So the DB comes up in run support, and there's no safety help over the top. And Nick Marshall on the run just raises up and throws a little flip to Sammy Coates on the run for the tying touchdown. The pop pass, as it's known. That drive was brilliant against those two defensive minds in Nick Saban and Kirby Smart. So let's never, ever, ever call the kick 6 lucky. Let's never suggest that Gus Malzahn was touched by angels from above or Auburn Jesus made an appearance. That may have been the case at the end of the Prairie and Jordan Hare. It was not the case in the kick 6 game. And those are the kind of memories. We can also throw in the comeback when Gus was the OC. And it's 2010. Auburn's undefeated. They're steaming towards an SEC championship, a national championship. Cam Newton is sprinting and powering his way toward a Heisman Trophy. And they're down 24-0 in Tuscaloosa before you can blink. And they came back. They came back because Alabama had stacked its defense to prevent Cam Newton from running the ball. And they did a good job of it on that day. Cam did not have a big day running the ball, but he threw for 3 touchdowns, ran for another, just running over people on a short yardage goal line play. And he threw the winning touchdown pass to now the late, may he rest in peace, Philip Lutzenkirchen. Greatest comeback I've ever witnessed. And I think under the circumstances, Alabama wasn't playing for a national championship that year, but Auburn was. The fact that they did that in that atmosphere in Bryant-Denny Stadium against what I've long called the most hostile crowd I have ever experienced in person, knowing how badly those folks wanted to knock down Auburn and take down Cam Newton, and then being ahead 24-0 and wanting to step on their neck. and not being able to do it, and watching Auburn come back and come back and come back, and then finally win the game. Again, one of those highlights that Auburn people will pass down to their ancestors for generation upon generation upon generation. Those things all happened in large part because of Gus Malzahn. That's why I say, for those reasons alone, not that there weren't highlights under Terry Bowden. He won his first 20 games. Not that there weren't highlights under Tommy Tuberville. He beat Alabama 6 straight, went undefeated in 2004, etc. Obviously, there was a highlight under Gene Chizik with a national championship, but again, it doesn't happen without Gus Malzahn. It just doesn't. So that brings us all to the point of this whole conversation, not just to skip down memory lane and highlight some of the incredible moments that were authored during the Gus Malzahn era, but to measure his legacy. What kind of legacy does he leave behind as a football coach, both in high school and in college? Well, here's one thing that stands out, and I give credit to my friend Brandon Marcello, who one of those folks in the media who knew Gus back when in Arkansas as a high school coach and maintained an incredible relationship with him through the years. And it was Brandon that pointed out in a tribute column, and you should read it on cbssports.com, that Gus Malzahn is the only coach in history. Listen to what I just said. The only coach in history to win 100 or more games as a high school coach and 100 or more games as a football bowl subdivision head coach. And of course, Gus got over 100 when he went on to Central Florida after Auburn. Think about that. 100 plus in high school, 100 plus in the FBS. That's an extraordinary accomplishment. And I don't think that people have given Gus enough credit for what he was able to do there. And it's not just the numbers. Well, there are some numbers. There's a number that stands out above all else. Brendan, can we pop up there the legacy slide? Because there is a stat above all the stats that define Gus Malzahn and the success he enjoyed. From 2013 through 2020, that was Gus's tenure as Auburn head coach, Nick Saban and Alabama lost a grand total of 6 Southeastern Conference football games. 6 SEC losses in 8 years. And 3 of those 6 losses came at the hands of Gus Malzahn and Auburn. And in each case, I would argue strongly, as I did at the time, those games happened, those upsets in many people's minds happened because Gus Malzahn outcoached Nick Saban, the greatest coach of all time. Think back to the 2019 Iron Bowl. Again, that was the last time Auburn beat Alabama in Jordan-Hare. It was 48-45. Mac Jones threw 6 touchdown passes for Alabama that day. Unfortunately for the Crimson Tide, he threw 4 of them to his own receivers and 2 of them to Auburn defenders. One of them was a 100-yard pick six. Wackiest game I think I've ever seen in terms of the game going back and forth. But Alabama had a chance late. If they could get a stop, they could get the ball back one last time. And Jalen Waddle was a wizard as a receiver, as a punt returner, as a playmaker. And if Auburn had to kick to him one more time, disaster likely awaited the Tigers. So on a 4th and short, Auburn, as a plan, as a strategic decision, they ran out the punt team, but they kept the quarterback on the field. They kept Bo Nix on the field. Alabama didn't know what was happening. Their defense was on. Their punt return team was off. They were trying to shuffle on 2 different units. And Waddle, the punt returner, stayed on as the defense came back on the field. Alabama had too many men on the field. They got flagged for it. Auburn got a first down because of the penalty, and they were able to kneel out the clock. And that was Gus Malzahn outsmarting Nick Saban. Maybe the last time he did so, but not the first. And that's why I say, look, Gus is known primarily as Nick Saban's nemesis, as Nick Saban's kryptonite. Again, He won half of the games that Saban lost from 2013 to 2020 came at the hands of Gus Malzahn. And that Auburn team, those Auburn teams in those years were not beating everyone. They were losing 4 or more games most years under Gus. But he had a magic. He had a knack. He had a way of getting his team to its peak for that game. And there are some Auburn people who will tell you that that's an antiquated way of thinking. That focusing on Alabama above all else, making Alabama your Super Bowl, hurts you in terms of competing for a national championship because you don't put that level of preparation, that level of effort, that level of energy into every single game. It's hard to do that 12 times a year during the regular season and beyond. But there's a point there. And in fact, Gus the other day did a podcast and he talked about how one of the things that Pat Dye told him when Gus got the Auburn job, the head coaching job, was if you'll spend 365 days a year trying to figure out how to beat Alabama, everything else will fall into place. And of course, Alabama fans love that because that just reinforces their notion that they play for national championships and Auburn plays for the state championship above all else. There's some truth to that. But it worked. It worked on the last Saturday in November 3 times in 8 years. Now, 3-5 doesn't sound like a great record if you just look at it as a raw number. But 3-5 against Nick Saban and Alabama during that time, that's elite. But that's not the beginning and the ending of Gus Malzahn's legacy. Think about this. He changed college football with his hurry-up, no-huddle offense. The for short, if you want to use the acronym. He changed the game. And there is no better example of that than what happened at Alabama after the kick 6. And as I said, it wasn't just the kick 6. Auburn ran for 294 yards in that 2013 Iron Bowl with Trey Mason, who was on the short list of Heisman finalists. Incredible. Set the Auburn rushing record that year. That was held by one Bo Jackson. Nick Marshall was an incredible runner. He was an incredible ball handler. He was a magician with the read option fakes and decisions. They led the nation in rushing that year. And this was a weird stat. I didn't realize this at the time. And I don't know if someone tipped me off to it or I looked it up on my own, but I realized, and I did some research, it still blows my mind. That was the first SEC team ever to lead the nation in rushing. Think about that. Now, a lot of times, service academies will lead the nation in rushing because they run the wishbone, or Oklahoma was running the wishbone. Nebraska was running the wishbone back in the day. Alabama was running the wishbone back in the day and running up big numbers. But until Auburn 2013, no SEC team had ever led the nation in rushing. True fact, look it up. Who did that? Gus Malzahn. And for all the trickeration that Gus was known for, his offense was all about a downhill running game. Yeah, it was done out of a hurry-up, no-huddle offense. They would rush to the line. They'd get a first down. And you know the thing Gus would do? And he was trying to get his team to hurry up, and people did memes about it. They put bongos in his hands, or they put maracas in his hands, or drumsticks in his hands, or boxing gloves in his hands, because that's what he would do. He would be over there like, go, go, go. Hurry, hurry, hurry. And it drove defenses crazy. It drove Nick Saban crazy because he couldn't substitute, and he couldn't change calls based on the look that the offense was giving him. And that's why he led the charge, along with Brett Bielema, who was at Arkansas at the time, to change the rules, to outlaw the hurry-up, no-huddle, to give defenses time to substitute and make adjustments based on the offense's look. Didn't go very far. So when that attempt failed, when Nick Saban's attempt to legislate Gus Malzahn's advantage out of the game, what did Nick Saban do? After the kick 6, hired Lane Kiffin, changed his offense, went more up-tempo, put more emphasis on offense, realized he could no longer win games on a consistent basis, 17-13, 20-17, 9-6, which was the score of the game of the century in which LSU beat Alabama back in 2011 in the regular season. Of course, Alabama got its revenge and then some in the national title game in New Orleans. But Gus Malzahn, more than anyone else, forced Nick Saban to change with the times, which was one of the greatest things about Saban, his ability to understand where the game was going and to adjust on the fly. And think about this. We talk a lot about the 2013 Iron Bowl, the kick six, the 2019 Iron Bowl, the 48-45. We don't talk as much about the 2017 Iron Bowl. It was 26-14. Auburn won that one, which put Auburn in the SEC championship game against Georgia. And if Kerryon Johnson hadn't gotten really banged up in that game against Alabama, who knows? Maybe Auburn beats Georgia. Maybe Auburn goes on to the playoff because Auburn had already beaten Georgia during the regular season. But the game that really shows Gus Malzahn's influence on college football was the 2014 Iron Bowl. You probably don't remember it. Most people don't remember it until I tell you the score. Alabama 55, Auburn 44. That's right. Nick Saban, in his first year with Lane Kiffin as his offensive coordinator, beat Gus Malzahn at his own game. Amari Cooper caught, 800 yards worth of passes that day? Because Kiffin, part of his genius as a play caller and offensive coordinator, was featuring his best player. That year, it was Amari Cooper as a wide receiver. The next year, Derrick Henry as a running back. But that was because of Gus Malzahn. 55-44. I think that's the most points Saban gave up and still won a game ever. I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think that's accurate. It's all because of Gus Malzahn. Gus Malzahn made Nick Saban change. And if you're looking at someone's career resume and you're trying to measure their impact and their legacy, it doesn't get much better than that. But before we get out of here, I want to share a couple of personal stories about Gus Malzahn because I think he's misunderstood in a lot of ways. And look, he wasn't a great recruiter. His offensive line recruiting at Auburn in the latter years in particular fell off, and that contributed to Auburn's decline. But Gus was, in my mind, from my personal experience, a genuinely good guy. Okay? And let me give you a couple of examples to highlight that. I've talked about the kick six game, which ended up Auburn 34, Alabama 28, sent Auburn to the SEC championship game, which they won, and then on to the BCS national championship game, the last BCS national championship game, which they should have won, which should be Gus's greatest regret, that they didn't close the door and finish the deal against Florida State in the Rose Bowl. But that game, that kick six game, it always bothered Gus when people suggested it was luck. How do I know this? Because in all the time that he was the head coach at Auburn, like I said, 8 years as a head coach, 3 years as offensive coordinator, I wrote a lot of things about him. Wrote a lot of columns about him. They weren't all complimentary. But I wrote a column some years later, and I don't even remember the subject matter. But in the column, I wrote something that he inferred that I was implying that Auburn won the kick six game because they got lucky. And he called me. He didn't call me to yell at me. He didn't call me to cuss at me. Gus didn't really cuss. But it bothered him. And I pointed out to him, Gus, you misread that, or I didn't explain myself properly. It's always really on you as a writer. If someone misinterprets what you say, it's often on you, not always, but often on you because you didn't explain yourself correctly. So you need to take responsibility as a writer, a commentator, an analyst, whatever. But he was bothered. And I said, Gus, more than anyone else in the media, I have given you credit for what that team did in that game because it was based on game planning and play calling and preparation and execution. And the number 294 is stuck in my brain forever. It may be 296. Maybe I'm a couple yards off. But they ran for close to 300 yards. That's the larger point. And he was fine with it. He said, okay, I understand. He said, I'll go back and reread it. And he said, you're right. You have given us credit for that. So he acknowledged that. And I thought that was a nice little anecdote to share the kind of person Gus was. He would get mad. He might get mad at something you wrote, but he would talk to you about it. And there's another highlight of my personal relationship, my professional relationship with Gus. We didn't have a personal relationship. We never did play ping pong. Something you don't know about Gus Malzahn is he considers himself a great ping pong player. And he had a really nice table at his house. I never went to his house, but I know he had the media over once or twice before the season, and they would play ping pong and he would talk about it. And I would kid with him. I'd say, I'm pretty good at ping pong as well. I'm going to challenge you and I'm going to take you down. And we never did actually play ping pong. Maybe now that he's retired and he's going to stay in the Auburn area, like most former Auburn coaches do, it's one of the most incredible phenomenon in college football. No matter how badly things end for any Auburn coach, many of them either keep their house in Auburn, I think Gus did, or on Lake Martin, which is not far away, and they return to live there after they're done coaching. So maybe this Auburn family thing isn't a gimmick. Maybe there's something to it. But last story, Alabama's playing Georgia. This is after the 2017 season, and Auburn's beaten them both, but they lost to Georgia in a rematch in the SEC championship game, so Georgia goes to the playoff. Alabama, despite losing the Iron Bowl and not even playing in the SEC championship, goes to the playoff, and now they've advanced to the national championship game in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. And Gus is doing television. So he's wearing a suit, and it's before the game. We, the media, we're mingling on the sideline, talking to people, trying to get some insight, talking to former players, coaches, whomever. And I'm on the Alabama sideline. And here comes Gus down through the stands. He's just finished a television pregame hit, probably on ESPN, if I remember correctly. And he starts walking towards me. So I walked up to him and, I'm going to shake his hand and, congratulate him on a nice season, et cetera, et cetera. And he doesn't give me a handshake. He gives me a bro hug. And I said, Gus, you see all these people up here in the seats? They're all Alabama fans on this side. They already think I'm a Barner. You're not helping the situation. And he gave me a devilish little grin, and he said, I know. So he enjoyed the fact that he could do something to make me look bad with the Alabama folks that were sitting, just yards away, getting ready for kickoff of the national championship game. That's the kind of sense of humor that Gus had. So where do we ultimately rank Gus Malzahn? I think he is the most important Auburn football coach after Pat Dye and Shug Jordan. Best, that's all relative, but importance, legacy, memories, outside of Pat Dye and outside of Shug Jordan, nobody in Auburn history beats Gus Malzahn. All right, that's going to do it for me for today. I'm Kevin Scarbinsky. This is Scarbo Knows. Thank you for watching on the Sidelines.live network. Make sure you check out all the great shows on the network with executive producer Brendan Martin. And make sure if you follow us or if you're watching us on YouTube, we would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel. As Bluto Blutarski says, that great philosopher, don't cost nothing, but it does help us. And thank you again to our sponsor, Money Management Services, the Rice family. I always say, good friends of mine. They'll take great care of you. Let's hear from them now. You guys have a great day.
Since 1992, Money Management Services in Birmingham has provided individuals and business owners with trusted, fee-only financial advice. We're more than advisors, we're your financial family. From retirement planning to tax strategies and estate planning, our team builds personalized wealth management plans tailored to your life. At Money Management Services, we treat you like family, because when you walk through our doors, you become part of ours.